Congratulations. He's the VC of Nalanda University, just appointed, taken over, and obviously, as we all know him, he's the Director General of RIS, a New Delhi-based, very, very important think tank, which does lots of work across the world, works on South-South cooperation, global trade, investment, WTO, name it, international economic relations. Professor Sachin has been at RIS for a long time and as the Director General, and RIS plays a very important role. We all know about it and the role it played, sterling role that it played in G20. He is chairing the session today. Our main speaker for the day is Professor Frankel. Now, before I formally read out, I must tell you that during my 1 year at Harvard as a postdoc in 2003 and 4, anything complex on international trade, I would go to Professor Frankel. And even after that, the way he taught that course, International Economics, I would sit in it. We had a seminar series there. I would sit in it because Professor Frankel can make, Jeff Frankel can make very complex things into very, very simple things. And as a postdoc, I was permitted to have lunch every Thursday at the Kennedy School where all the faculty which deals with international economics would come in, and Danny Roderick would be there, and Ricardo would be there. All the faculty which teaches international economics at Harvard Kennedy School would be there. And therein, again, I felt that Professor Frankel is the person I can go to in case of any complex situation. As you know, tariff wars have been complex. We have been very fortunate to have had 4 lectures on tariff wars after the new administration came in USA, but I was still feeling we are not on top of it. And then finally, I requested Professor Jeff Frankel if he can kindly come and speak to us, simplify the whole tariff war the way it is happening. And he kindly agreed. So I'm so thankful and indebted to him. Professor Frankel is James W. Harpel Professor of Capital Formation and Growth at the Kennedy School. He is the Research Associate at the NBER. He has served at the Council for Economic Advisors in 83-84 and 96-99 as CA member in the Clinton administration. Frankel's responsibilities included international economics, macroeconomics, and the environment. Before coming to Harvard, he was professor of economics at Berkeley. His research interests include currencies, commodities, crisis, international finance, monetary policy, fiscal policy, regional trade blocs, and international environmental issues. He graduated from Swarthmore College and received his economics PhD from MIT. With that, I hand over the session to Professor Sachin to take the proceedings further. Professor Sachin.
Thank you. Thanks, Professor Charan Singh ji. It's a great pleasure to be back at EGROW, and I must congratulate you for consistently providing us this very important platform to discuss most contemporary issues. This gives us immense opportunity to connect with some of the world's best minds, bring in contemporary discussions, but with theoretical rigor and academic framework. So I think it's a great pleasure. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this EGROW webinar seminar series that Professor Charan Singh ji has already introduced us to, tariff warfare and globalization. And this, I think, is an extremely important, very contemporary issue. Some people have been raising issues in terms of how globalization should be calibrated, in what way we require it to go forward, particularly with the connect of financialization with globalization. The trade debates and discussions moved in some direction, and US was the one that was bringing in some of these debates forward. We have heard people like Danny Roderick to say, has the globalization gone very far? But then we are hearing from US itself the whole debate now revisiting the tariff warfare that is the topic of the day. We are also in India looking forward for India-US BTA discussion. Everybody is worried about 9th July now, when the 90th day pause would come to an end. We are also trying to see how the US Court of International Trade is going to address and further accelerate a tariff uncertainty that we are seeing. Steel and aluminium, 50% double safeguard duties are also our concern. But friends, as a group of economists here, we are also concerned about the impact of tariffs on prices and on welfare. Loss of welfare is a concern. What would happen to US prices is a concern. What would happen to MFN and WTO is a concern. We are also concerned in terms of how this tariff war would also bring in tariff rate quotas. They would bring in ad valorem tariffs and their contestations that are there. So I'm extremely happy that Professor Charan Singh approached Jeff, and great that he could bring in his perspectives as macroeconomist, his work on globalization and trade and tariffs and their impact, his ideas on trade wars and global stability have been there for some time for us to see. It is also a very interesting point at this moment to analyze whether globalization has really gone too far, or are we doing some basic trouble. What we are hearing now from US is something that we used to hear from the developing countries 20 years ago. With greater integration of the emerging markets in the global scenario, things have changed, and things have changed forever. We are also seeing verticalization of trade, where trade among the global South countries has intensified, and you are seeing a declining trend among the G7 countries. These trends are discernible, evident, and taking far more profound shape than ever before. In this backdrop, I once again welcome each one of you, and now give the floor to our great professor today, who would be addressing us on tariff warfare and globalization, Professor Jeffrey Frankel. The floor is yours, sir.
Well, thank you. Thank you for those introductions. Thank you for inviting me to speak to this group. I have my PowerPoint presentation. I'm going to say down each time I want to go to the next one. But by the way, can you hear me okay, Sharon? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, good. So my topic today is tariff warfare and globalization. Next slide. Pretty widely remarked on April 2nd, after promising it for 90 days or longer, since early after inauguration, President Donald Trump announced so-called reciprocal tariffs. And here's a famous photo of him with a table showing for some countries what the tariffs are supposed to be. Down. Reciprocal tariff sounds like matching the foreign tariffs with U.S. tariffs, but it's nothing like that at all. The computations were not based on what other countries' tariffs were, or even the attempts to quantify non-tariff barriers by other countries. Down. Rather, they were based on bilateral merchandise trade balances, crude calculations of what it might take by way of tariff to set bilateral merchandise trade balances at zero. Well, this is really nonsense. Doesn't make sense. No reason to look at the trade balance and exclude other elements of the balance of payments, or at least the current account. No reason to look at merchandise trade balance and exclude services. The U.S. runs a surplus in services, partially offsetting a deficit in merchandise. and particularly no reason why bilateral deficits should ever be zero. Even if your overall trade is balanced, of course, you have bilateral imbalances. Economists like to point out that when we go to the barber for a haircut, the barber wants to be paid in cash. If we tried to pay him with an economics lecture, he wouldn't accept the payment. Rather, we earn our cash by giving lectures, in my case at Harvard University, and then using the money to buy the haircut. And similarly with countries, no reason why bilateral balances should be zero. Down. Down. The tariffs that Trump announced on April 2nd obviously had not much thought had gone into them. They included Heard Island and McDonald Islands, which are in the Indian Ocean and are uninhabited except by penguins. Next. Here's a photograph of the penguin delegate negotiating with Donald Trump and the vice president. Next. Even before Trump, the upward trend in world trade had come to a halt. So let's briefly review the history of the last 2 centuries. Next. There was a steady increase in the ratio of trade to GDP, both in the US and globally in the 19th century, starting perhaps after the Napoleonic Wars, but really getting going after the repeal of the Corn Laws in the 1840s. This was partly technological progress, replacement of sailing ships, wooden-hulled sailing ships with steam-powered steel-hulled ships and the screw propeller, and the invention of the telegraph, which made it possible to know what the price of cotton was in Liverpool, and then whether you wanted to send your cotton crop there or somewhere else. Also, Pax Britannica, probably isn't remembered as in that way from India, but it did furnish stability in the world system for quite so many years. And the gold standard. All of these contributed to the steady globalization up until 1914. Next. 1914, of course, was World War I, followed in the 20s and 30s by isolationism and protectionism. In the US, even before the famous Smoot-Hawley Tariff, we adopted something called the Ford-Macomber Tariff in the 1920s, and then the Smoot-Hawley Tariff in 1930. Trade contracted sharply, and going on into the formation of trading blocs and World War II. Next. What happened in the interwar period shows that although technological progress may in some sense be inevitable or irreversible, that what governments do in the way of trade policy and politics has big effects and can turn the clock back. After the war, of course, there was a consensus, or at least a decision on part of some countries to free trade had worked much better. The lessons were drawn from the interwar period, that the tariffs had been very damaging, that had contributed to the collapse of trade and the fragmentation of the world economic and political system. And after the war, we established the GATT, which eventually became the WTO, and the United Nations and the IMF and so on, which succeeded in removing tariff barriers steadily and increasing the ratio of trade to GDP from 1945 up until about 2008. Next. Since 2008, which is, of course, before Donald Trump, so I suppose we can't blame it completely on him, the globalization trend has come to a halt, or maybe even slightly reversed, according to the measure of trade to GDP. Sometimes called slowbalization, sometimes called fragmentation, many terms. Next slide. Here's a graph showing U.S. tariffs which were quite high at periods in the 19th century, had come down. Next slide. I mean, next arrow. Had come down between the 1940s up until 2017, and they were quite low by 2017, almost zero to a first approximation, maybe 2%, and similarly in most other countries, they were quite low. Next. It was said at that time, around the turn of the century, in the 2000s, that since tariffs were close to zero, the next project should be deep integration, involving intellectual property rights and the environment and labor, and going beyond simple removal of tariffs. Next. Here is the increase in tariff. First part of this year, you can see it rising virtually to the same level as Smoot-Hawley. Next. Here it is again and focused. Next. You see the increases of the 20s and 1930 in the U.S. tariffs, and they were retaliated against by trading partners around the world, or emulated. It became a general phenomenon, a new system that there be high tariffs, which collapse trade. Next. Next. Here's the steady process of liberalization. Next. As of April 12, next, the overall effective tariff rate on the part of the U.S. was greater than under Smoot-Hawley. It's come back down a bit. Trump has backed off of 145% tariff against China, for example, but not that much. And when the tariff policy settles down, he seems to still be changing it every few days, but when it settles down, it'll probably be below April 12th, below Smoot-Hawley, but not by much. It'll still be an enormous increase relative to before this trade war started. Next. 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 Here's one depiction of the takeoff, the Industrial Revolution, takeoff in income per capita in the 19th century. Next, by Europe and European settled regions, and then in the 20th century, spreading to Asia and other countries. Next. Here's WTO membership. On average, it's estimated to have boosted trade among its members. This is dated relative to when a country joined the WTO. Now, simply joining doesn't necessarily have much effect if at the same time, but the countries that did the full set of reforms did experience an increase in growth. Next. Next. Is the correlation between trade and income causal? There's all kinds of ways in which it might not be causal. What if countries join the WTO and cut tariffs as a result of higher income brought about by other causes rather than as a source of higher income? Next. One can isolate the variation in trade to GDP, which is due to geographic factors, which are exogenous, as opposed to trade policy. Next. On the horizontal axis is a predictor of trade based solely on geography, whether countries share a common border, how far away they are from each other, whether they have a coastline, whether they speak a common language. And on the vertical axis is trade openness, trade to GDP. And there's a pretty strong, significant relationship. Next. Here's Hong Kong, which it's predicted to be very open to trade because it's close to big populations of China and Japan and big growing economies. Next. And here's Tonga, which is quite remote and is predicted to have low trade, and sure enough, does have low trade. So these are exogenously determined variations in openness. Next. Even these exogenously determined predictors of openness have a statistically significant effect on growth. That's the point. It's not due to, or at least not primarily due to, the endogeneity of tariff policy. Next. So I did this in a paper quite some years ago, and I have a more recent citation below it. Next slide. Well, I've made a pretty strong argument for free trade, but what does the case for free trade leave out? To be sure, there's a number of arguments and factors. Next. It leaves out the environment. That's one, which I'll elaborate on, and then I'll proceed to talk about income distribution, monopoly power, and dynamic spillover effects in manufacturing. Next. Effects of trade on the environment. Next. There are both positive effects and negative effects. Negative effects, such as a race to the bottom in regulation, are pretty well known, that firms in each country that are engaged in international competition will put political pressure on the government not to regulate them too highly, for arguing that this would disadvantage them in international competition. Next. But there are positive effects of trade on environmental quality as well. You can achieve your goals, whether it's growth in income or environment or whatever your goals are, more efficiently through using international trade. Next. There's also some of the effects come via GDP and the environmental Kuznets curve. Some are independent. Some trade has effects even holding GDP constant. Next. One beneficial effect of trade on environmental quality is trade in green products. The big growth areas now, of course, are EVs, batteries, solar panels, wind turbines. The cost of renewable energy has been brought down over the last 10 years enormously, contributing to the energy transition. And the fall in the cost of the renewable energy equipment is in large part due to international trade. Next. All right, that's environmental quality. Next, income distribution. Saying that trade increases the size of the total pie, GDP, leaves aside the question of how it's allocated. Trade, like any big change, creates both winners and losers. Removing tariffs creates winners and losers. Putting on tariffs creates winners and losers. Next. In theory, trade should hurt unskilled labor in the U.S., which has relatively less unskilled labor, and when it has to compete on world markets, its relative incomes should go down, which would increase inequality. Next. But in developing countries like India, it should hurt skilled labor, which is a relatively scarce factor and does relatively better. Next. In practice, trade has no consistent effect on within country inequality. Next. The prediction that trade would reduce inequality within developing countries is not, in fact, borne out. Next. Here are some citations on that. Next. Trade cuts extreme poverty, and that is a very important source of improved income distribution globally. Next. It's one of the factors, I think, contributing to the fall in extreme poverty from 58% globally in 1950 to 8% in 2020. Next. It probably contributed a bit to rising inequality within the US, confirming the predictions of the EGROW model since 1980. Next. I'll go on after showing you a graph or two of the look at monopoly power and dynamic effects. Next. Trade has no consistent effect on inequality within countries. This shows the trade openness index on the horizontal axis and income equality as measured by the Gini coefficient on the vertical axis, no relationship. Next. As I said, trade helps cut extreme poverty, at least inequality has gone down next, as the arrow shows, at the same time that trade has gone up. And one of the papers I just cited suggests that there's a causal relationship. Next. Trade, I said, may have contributed to rising inequality within the US, next, and perhaps other other industrial countries, especially via the so-called China shock from 2001 to 2014. Next. Next. Theory says winners gain enough to compensate the losers. Next. But the standard diagnosis of US politics is that the government failed to compensate the losers, so they were left behind by trade, and that's why they voted for Trump. To be honest, it's hard for me to explain why so many Americans voted for Trump, but this is kind of a leading explanation. Next. Clinton and Obama and Biden did try to help those left behind by trade or technology or whatever else. A major successful step was the Affordable Care Act, also called Obamacare, which greatly expanded health care coverage to households that did not have it. Next. What we haven't gotten very far on is further expansion of health insurance. Republicans, Trump tried to roll it back, and the Democrats try to expand it. Reversing tax cuts for the rich, which is been a major priority of Republicans, is to cut taxes for the rich. And this week, the bill in the House and the Senate doubles down, renews the tax cuts of 2017 and extends them. Universal preschool education would be another ways of helping those who are left behind for the next generation. Meanwhile, Trump's tariffs are hurting lower income households more than they hurt the rich. They lower the cost of the living standards for everybody, but as the next graph will show, more so for lower income households. Next. So here, this bar chart shows the loss of real income by different deciles. Next. The lowest deciles, lower income households in the US, are suffering the most from the higher prices from the Trump tariffs and lower income. Next. The higher income households also are hit by this, but not as badly. Next. All right, on to the next factor that the standard case for free trade leaves out. Next. Monopoly power. The classic theory of gains from trade assumed perfect competition. In reality, especially for large countries and large firms, sellers have some monopoly power. Next. But that is at best an argument against unilateral liberalization. It doesn't work against multilateral rules that are the basis of our international regime, liberalizing trade under negotiated agreements. If everybody tries to raise tariffs to exploit their monopoly power to shift the terms of trade in their favor, everybody's worse off. So we gain by agreeing not to do that. Next. And then dynamic spillover effects, which are hypothesized to be important in manufacturing. Next. Well, my response to that is technology and spillover effects by learning by doing are important in agriculture and mining as well, not just manufacturing. Next. You can't subsidize everything. Next. Next. Well, let's just briefly recap what I and generally is called the rules-based global system. Next. It's true that China has engaged in some discriminatory trade practices. Next. But Trump has violated U.S. trade obligations under the GATT, under the WTO, and even the USMCA, which was his own creation. He said NAFTA was the worst trade agreement in history, and the USMCA, U.S. Mexico Canada agreement was historic, was the best. But he's violating that flagrantly. Next. The rules under which the GATT and the WTO and the USMCA were written were shaped to a large extent by U.S. leadership. Next. And I think this was sensible, the direction in which the U.S. pushed. There are all kinds of details, of course. One could take different positions on how strong should be the intellectual property rights, patent protection, and so on of multinational corporations. But the rules were beneficial. Next. As I mentioned, everyone is better off agreeing and abiding by multilateral government commitments not to intervene in trade. Next. And that argument holds even with monopoly power. Next. Well, I'm getting towards the end of my prepared remarks. What is Trump's strategy? This is something people ask a lot. What's the method to the madness? What does he have in mind? One often hears that he stakes out an extreme bargaining position, knowing that he's not going to get it, but as a negotiating point, and then he'll bargain and negotiate a favorable deal where the trading partners will make concessions, and the U.S. will give back off the highest tariffs. Next. Trump is often described as transactional, which I take to be kind of a euphemism for meaning negotiating deals that have short-term benefits, or maybe benefits for him personally, but let's say short-term benefits. And next bullet. Transactional means sacrificing longer-term objectives like the word of the U.S. president, the reputation of the U.S. for abiding by agreements, preservation of the trading system, and so on. This is the hypothesis of what he's doing. Next. But I ask, where are the deals that bring the benefits? I don't see it. Next. What seems to fit best is he likes non-zero tariffs, bespoke, different with different trading partners, not as an economic objective or tool, but he likes to have U.S. CEOs and foreign leaders come to him as supplicants. He's a couple times described leaders coming to him saying, "Oh, please, sir, I'll do anything. Just reduce the tariffs." And you know that that's not actually happening in the way he described, but it's very revealing for what he wants, what really he derives satisfaction from. There are other examples of this. Lack of what I would call forward thinking, lack of strategy, and declaring victory when he has some superficial concession by the other side, but without really achieving much. outside of trade policy. I'm thinking, for example, of the discussions with Kim Jong-un over nuclear weapons in North Korea. Trump proclaimed it a great accomplishment and success when he was able to meet Kim Jong-un for negotiations, supposedly in Singapore and elsewhere. But nothing actually came out of it. He just declared victory, but then went home, and the North Koreans proceeded with their nuclear program. And that seems to me kind of the pattern. And that's what I predict will happen here. He will, well, it already happened perhaps with the UK, where we agreed to cut tariffs back part way, and what they agreed to was just a fig leaf, nothing really different than they were doing already, but he declared it a victory. So I think that's what will happen, but only after he's inflicted a lot of damage on the world trading system, on the economies of other countries, and on the U.S. economy. How am I doing for time? Should I go on or stop for questions?
Yes, I think we can for another 4 or 5 minutes, and then we open it up for discussion.
Okay. Sounds good. Next slide. Go down 2. Down. I'll talk a bit more about the loss of U.S. manufacturing jobs, because that is a common interpretation of what the goal is, not just by Trump and his trade policy, but by Biden and a lot of the American political system and voters and politicians. Next. U.S. manufacturing employment has fallen steadily. As a percentage of total employment, it's been falling since 1939. At that point, at the start of World War II, manufacturing jobs were 39% of total U.S. jobs, and it fell steadily subsequently to 8%. It's not just something that happened when the China shock came along, when China joined the world trading system. It's been underway for quite some time, 90 years. Next. The blue line is total manufacturing jobs, as opposed to share of the labor force. They continued to rise up until, 1960 or so. They've been declining since then. Next. Is the decline in U.S. manufacturing jobs due to trade deficits? Well, one point is we weren't running a trade deficit in the 50s and 60s, when manufacturing employment was decreasing as a percentage of the total. Next. But I like to point out that Germany and Japan, who run substantial trade surpluses, have had the same decrease in the percentage of employment in manufacturing. This shows Germany. Next. 1970 to the present, manufacturing employment has declined in Germany, notwithstanding a sizable trade surplus. Next. To make an analogy and to kind of motivate why we shouldn't pay so much attention to the statistic, the percentage of employment that is taken up by manufacturing jobs, look at agricultural jobs. Next. At the birth of the country, at the beginning of the U.S., 1790, farm jobs were about 90% of total employment. We were an agrarian country, like most countries. But it fell. Next. Agricultural employment fell substantially with the invention of new technology and new farming techniques, almost continuously from the 1930s up until the present. today only 2% of the American workforce works on the farms. Some people lament this. They lament the loss of farming jobs. They lament the loss of manufacturing jobs. It's pretty clearly nostalgia and idealizing what life in the countryside was like in the case of farm jobs. But one could ask, would we really like to still have such low productivity that we had to have 90% of the workforce in agriculture? And the same applies to manufacturing, even though it's so widespread that Americans believe that we need to have a higher employment in manufacturing. We'd be nuts to go back to a time when most workers had to work at dangerous, exhausting jobs in agriculture or in factories. Next. We should celebrate the productivity gains in agriculture, not want to go back for them. Why do voters yearn for return to excuse me.
So, Professor Frankel, another 1 or 2 minutes and then we close?
Yep, that was what I was thinking. Why do voters yearn for return to manufacturing? There's the bar chart is going to show, but one of the most interesting graphs that I've run into recently. Next. Suggesting that maybe it's nostalgia. This asks on the left-hand side, the two bars for either all Americans or Republicans specifically, whether they think that America would be better off with more manufacturing jobs, more people working in factories, and 80% say yes. So this corresponds to the standard view that our politicians have support in pursuing manufacturing jobs via tariffs or whatever. But the right-hand bars show what happens if you ask people, would they feel better off working in manufacturing? Next. And the answer is no, they don't want the jobs for themselves. Only 20% say that they would be better off if they worked in a factory. So they want other people to do it. And I think this suggests that it's not true economic welfare that is at stake here, but nostalgia for an idealized time when factories gave a better standard of life than they in fact actually gave. All right, those are my slides. I'm happy to take questions or participate in general.
Thank you. Thanks, Professor Franklin, for highlighting very substantive components in terms of how you see this current scenario and in what way you find the whole dimension of impact of tariffs on skilled and unskilled, which I found quite interesting the way you captured it, but also in terms of what free trade actually leaves out in terms of environment quality and contributing to monopoly power and the dynamic spillovers that you captured. So very interesting points that have come in, how the rise in effective tariff that has happened and from 1934 to 2017, very interesting chart that you presented in terms of how tariffs were brought down by US and in what way the recent surge is going to be counterproductive. So excellent. Let me now open the floor and invite comments. Please be precise and help me manage time. We have another 8 to 10 minutes, so we would quickly close. So I see from Professor Charan Singh himself. So Professor Charan Singh, yeah.
Jeff, fantastic. Means I'm taken back to my Harvard days 15 years ago. I'm so impressed. A quick question for you. I know you have been the advisor to the president yourself. Now, my own reading as an economic profession, none of us at our age would prefer protectionism coming back again. We have gone through the journey of globalization. Now, as you mentioned, probably he is not stupid. He just tries to negotiate and takes an extreme position and then settles down somewhere in the middle. Is that, you think, the conclusion? Or do you think somewhere his economic advisors are letting the economic profession down by asking him to do this? Thank you.
Well, thanks for the question, Sharon. No, I don't subscribe to the view that he's staking out a strong position in order to bargain something more sensible. I just don't think he thinks ahead. I think he lives in the present, doesn't think about the past or the future. And if it feels good and his supporters, the base, if they applaud, and if it makes him feel like a tough guy and look like a tough guy, he says it, and he does it without thinking ahead. His advisors let him down. There's only one economist advisor who he pays attention to. It's Peter Navarro, who is a card-carrying economist, but he was chosen because he has these unique views unique among economists about trade and tariffs.
Next, anyone? Maybe I think in chat box also we are getting some dimensions, so we need to quickly bring forward. I see Dr. Ranjit Singh ji, please. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair and Press Jeffrey. I must congratulate Dr. Charan Singh. I have two quick questions. One is, what should be India's strategy in the ongoing bilateral trade agreement? That is one. Second, you have talked about globalization also. What will be the tariff, Trump's tariff impact on globalization, and by that way on the future of WTO? Thank you.
On the first question, what India should do, like any country, I think match what the U.S. does, behavior that's more truly reciprocal than the so-called reciprocal tariffs. Try not to get him riled up. He takes offense at kind of trivial things and can be diverted from the substance of the policy issue. But I think countries should, the best they can do is to retaliate, tit for tat, in hopes that the Americans, and particularly Trump, will come to see the disadvantages of pursuing this policy. I don't think it really works to try to negotiate an agreement with him, because it's not even clear what he wants in most cases. It changes over time. It's often something that can't be delivered, like a bilateral balance of zero or so on. Let's see, could you clarify the second question?
My second question is, what will be the future of WTO and globalization, which set in 1995? Well, that's...
You're saying the WTO dates from 1995, and what's the future?
Yeah.
It was disappointing already before Trump that we weren't able to carry out further rounds of negotiation after the Uruguay round. There was going to be a so-called Doha round, but it's gotten much worse now. I think that the WTO has been crippled, in particular by what the U.S. Has done. We're basically ignoring agreements that we made. I would hope that after Trump, there'd be some swinging back of the pendulum. I think there will be. But I doubt if we'll be able to reconstruct. Unfortunately, I don't think we'll be able to reconstruct the WTO in its form that we envisioned only 10 or 15 years ago.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Professor Steph, we also have a question in the chat box where Ms. Meenu is inquiring whether tariff warfare is a temporary response to global economic shifts, or is it becoming a long-term trend in the global economy?
Well, it's a long-term phenomenon to have deflected what had been the trend for the previous 70 or 80 years. I think it'll probably be temporary. The interwar period did come to an end eventually, and I think that this period of backtracking and globalization will also come to an end eventually. But a lot of damage will be done in the meantime.
Thank you. I don't see any more questions coming up. Anybody who has any clarification to seek from this brilliant exposition that we had today of the contemporary global situation, but also the US approach and how that would influence the global economy and US economy's own positioning. The fact that rule-based order, the idea of WTO and our collective commitment for multilateralism, that itself is under threat. The theoretical nuancing that Professor Frankel explained to us, I think makes the situation all the more challenging in terms of how we go forward. So from that point of view, we can bring forward any point that you feel would be required for us to clarify. Anybody now? The floor is open, and I think I don't see anyone. Professor Charan Singh ji, do you want to come back with any clarifications to seek?
I'm very impressed because the way Professor has handled the inequality and then the poverty, I think he's explained it so well that we have very little alternative but to go in for globalization. Means that it's very difficult to get back and retrace. And I think he's right. The next 3 years could be 3-4 years if Trump doesn't change his discourse. Probably it will be very disruptive for the world economic order. And especially countries like emerging countries like ours, who have been benefiting and taking the advantage and been working on poverty reduction, benefiting from it, I think are going to face a major problem. Even in America, where I have myself seen, though my experience in America has been limited, but the type of things that come from the international markets, the costing of it is so low that there's a segment of the society which takes advantage of those low prices and is able to survive. I, as a student, married person with a family, was able to handle. So I think Professor Frankel is right. International trade has many advantages, and if we try to be disruptive, there can be disadvantages. By the way, I was of the view that probably Jeff, I don't know if you would be comfortable with this question, but euro is coming out as an alternative to the dollar now. And I think the euro is trying to send a message to the Americans that put your house in order. Otherwise, Madame Lagarde there is playing I think, a very prominent role in positioning euro up there. What would be your view on that?
Well, if we expand it to a larger question of Europe's role, I think a slight silver lining to this whole situation is that Europe may finally, because it can no longer rely as heavily on the U.S., take a more active role. I would mind, for example, defending the territorial integrity of Ukraine, and that if Europe plays a more active role in the world political and economic system, I think that would be desirable. The euro, I don't know. I mean, we've been warning for decades now that the world might get tired of absorbing ever greater quantity of U.S. Treasury securities, and that the dollar might lose its status as the #1 international currency. And up until now, there hasn't been a challenge to it, a challenger to it. The euro meets some of the requirements as an international currency, the size of the euro the economy, for example, the ability of the currency to hold its value. Those are as strong as the case of the U.S., but it's lacking some other things. We may be at a turning point. One of the things that was remarkable about the March and April, when Trump announced his tariff policies and started cutting government employment in a kind of reckless way, is that yes, global uncertainty went up, but in the past, when global uncertainty goes up, even when the origin is something that happens in the United States, with like the U.S. subprime mortgage crisis of 2008, what's always happened is that international investors have pulled out of high-risk assets, like the stock market, and but in particular emerging market assets, and gone into the dollar as a safe haven. And that has been the strongest demonstration that the U.S. retains its role as a #1 international currency. But that changed this time around. And in reaction to the chaos in March and April, investors went out of dollars into other countries' assets. So I think that whether the euro challenges the dollar is perhaps less important than whether Europe steps into the breach, to some extent, the vacuum of leadership of the global system in line with liberal democratic values. But it's something to watch.
I think a very important point, Professor Johnson, you raised in terms of how this tariff war may turn into or lead to currency wars, and I think the situation in terms of undermining rule-based order, bringing in predictability in global trade, may create much larger challenges for us than mere undermining of WTO provisions. So thanks a lot, Professor Frankel, for very stimulating discussion today, this evening here in India and in your morning. I think the crossroads have come for us in global governance of trade. The challenges are immense, and as we discussed, welfare losses that would be there for developing countries would be huge. They would be largely in terms of identifying the priorities that countries would have to identify in terms of how they get together. The BRICS summit is coming in, and proposals are to address how global governance of trade should be addressed. So there are these multiple configurations at the global level which are going to address trade, investment, complementarities on one end, and the global trade architecture on the other, currency priorities, and their sequencing in terms of global leveraging of strength would also be witnessed in the days to come. So I think we are in a very exciting times, which are also depressing, but also changing the world order the way it was conceived and taken forward after the Second World War. 9th July, however, remains a date where after 90 days pause, we would see what happens. But in between, we are seeing almost all countries are trying to have some mini trade deals with the US and trying to cope up with the pressure that it may have. We are also witnessing new possibilities for multilateral entities, even the regional trading arrangements, how they prevail. But thanks a lot for very stimulating evening. Thanks, Professor Charan Singh ji, for getting EGROW on this great trail for expositions and explorations in future, but also understanding our past and contemporary situation. So thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for your participation, for engagement in such large numbers today. I once again thank for this opportunity to EGROW. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Sachin, Professor Jeff, to be with us. I somehow see we are back into a tripolar world. Euro GDP is nearly 18 trillion. China, singular country, is 19 trillion. USA, of course, is 25 odd trillion. So maybe we are heading into a tripolar world. At the end of next 3 years, probably it will become more clear where Euro has inched up, where China has gone, and where has America gone. You are right, Sachin. Very interesting times, very challenging. And at our age, when you've seen the world evolve, sometimes it's very desettling too. So thank you once again. The recording of this session will be available tomorrow by noon. We'll put it on the website and share with each one of you. Next week, we have a professor from Berkeley talking to us about poverty. Almost same time, because Berkeley is just the other side, so it will be a little later than this. I will send you the link and we'll again think over poverty issue. So once again, have a great weekend. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you.